Hello everyone, I am Overkill, and today's video is on the forces of Clan Pestilens. In this video, I will go over the lore, stats, and special rules for each of their lords, as well as how I think they would translate from tabletop to Total Warhammer. I am including only characters that receive stats for tabletop, and that have a special lore connection to Clan Pestilens. While I will go over all the Pestilens characters, my primary focus will be on characters not yet in Total Warhammer. I will not include any characters or units introduced in the End Times or Age of Sigmar. For references, I'll use the Skaven 7th edition army book, the Clan Pestilens army list from the Skaven 6th edition army book, the Bubonic Court of Nurglitch army list from the Lustria expansion, and the article Warpstone from White Dwarf Australia number 245. If you're interested in having some text to follow along with or would prefer to read instead of watch the video, click the link in the top right hand corner or in the description below. With all that out of the way, let us get started. When going into battle, Clan Pestilens has 4 Lord options. This includes Nurglitch, Skrolk, Plague Lords, and Plague Pontifexes. At the very top of Clan Pestilens sits Arch Plague Lord Nurglitch. Nurglitch was the first of the Plague Lords of Clan Pestilens, and was responsible not only for their ascension as a clan and their seat on the Council of 13, but also for the corruption that gnarls their bodies and marks their souls. Now I will move on to his stats. Before I begin, however, there are several things to note. First, Nurglitch never appeared in an army book. He was only given stats in the 6th edition expansion Lustria. Second, he never had a profile for just himself. The only tabletop profile given is called Nurglitch and Retinue, which includes Nurglitch, his attendant Belos, and his mount Pox. These 3 characters are considered one model, so when I refer to Nurglitch, I am referring to his Nurglitch and Retinue profile. As I believe that Nurglitch would be a melee caster hybrid lord, I determined his total war stats by comparing him to other hybrid lords like Skrolk and Manfred. On tabletop, Nurglitch was extremely expensive, costing more than even a Vermin lord. With all his abilities, spells, and items, Nurglitch should cost about 28 to 2900 gold. As Nurglitch is mounted, he should be large, and since he is a lord, have a model count of 1. His mount is a Great Pox Rat. This made him count as normal cavalry, not monstrous. A Great Pox Rat has poison attacks and the Verminous Cavalry special role, which gave it a smaller size than other normal cavalry. On tabletop, Nurglitch could take a rather high number of wounds, so he should have higher health than most other lords. As for armor, Nurglitch doesn't wear any external armor, so he will only get a small amount provided by his natural toughness, as well as some for being mounted. Nurglitch should have average leadership for a Skaven lord. On tabletop, Nurglitch had the speed of most lords on foot, so even though he is mounted, his movement speed is extremely slow for a large unit. As he had the same weapon skill as Skrolk, a warlord, or an assassin on tabletop, he should have similar melee attack and melee defense values. As for modifiers to his attack, Nurglitch had several items. First, he wields the Blade of Nurglitch. This is not a special item, but a magic weapon that can be wielded by any Skaven character capable of wielding magic weapons. It can already be seen in-game as a common weapon in Skaven campaigns, where it grants poison and magic attacks. In campaign, he could be allowed to start with the Blade of Nurglitch in his weapon slot, and have it as an option to take in multiplayer. Second, Nurglitch and Belos both have sensors that grant the same effects as Plague sensors. Plague sensors are already in the game, and give magical attacks and the contaminated effect. To get Nurglitch's attacks correct, he needs to do magic damage and inflict both contaminated and poison. Nurglitch was allowed a very high number of attacks per turn on tabletop, more than even a Vermin lord. This would translate into a very fast attack speed. As his tabletop strength is average for a Skaven lord, he should have a weapon strength of 400, split about even between regular and AP damage. For magic, Nurglitch is a level 3 wizard in the Skaven lore of Plague. He always knows the 3 spells, Pestilent Breath, Death Frenzy, and Plague. Perhaps he could start a campaign knowing all 3 instead of just 1 like typical spellcasters. Nurglitch carries 1 unique item, the Bubonic Scepter. This allowed him to select an enemy and roll for each model in the enemy unit. Every successful roll would cause a wound with no armor saves. This could translate to a direct damage magical item that ignores armor and is good against units with a lot of models. Now, I will move on to special rules. Nurglitch's first special rule is Causes Terror, meaning he would cause fear and terror in Total Warhammer. Nurglitch's second special rule is Passion of the Putrid. This meant that Nurglitch always had Frenzy and Hatred. In addition, as long as Nurglitch was still alive, his army would also never lose Frenzy. This could translate into Nurglitch having an aura that grants him and nearby units Frenzy, and a buff to weapon damage. His third special rule is Scion of Corruption. Nurglitch receives a 5+ ward save. In addition, Nurglitch and any unit he is a part of is immune to damage from Skaven magic and the lore of Nurgle, with the only exception being Warp Lightning. The ward save would amount to a 33% ward save in game. He could also have an aura that grants him and nearby units magical resistance. His final special rule is the Grim Ague. Enemy units near Nurglitch suffer -1 weapon skill. Any units in contact with Nurglitch suffer a strength 4 hit, with no armor saves allowed. This could translate to yet another aura debuffing enemy melee attack and melee defense, as well as causing constant damage similar to the Plague Furnace. I think that if implemented right, Nurglitch could make for a great addition, with the ability to debuff enemies and buff allies through a mix of attacks, auras, and spells. Nurglitch would make for an interesting hybrid melee caster lord, as his high health and ward save would allow him to survive in melee long enough to support his units. I will now move on to Skrolk. As Skrolk is in the game already, I will go over his lore and share some interesting notes about how Creative Assembly translated him to Total War. That Lord Skrolk walks the world, is an affront to nature, and a sign of power of the Great Horned Rat. Plants wither and die where Skrolk treads, and the very air about him seems to congeal and darken, as if stained by his baleful presence. Skrolk is ancient, having existed many spans of even the most long-lived of his foul kind. Rather than weakening with age, Lord Skrolk is possessed with a diabolic vitality that belies the years and the heaped diseases he carries. Indeed, Skrolk is bent and gnarled under the weight of countless corruptions. The flesh that is not hidden by his tattered shroud is leathery and covered in a layer of dripping buboes. Even worse, the mysterious hunching growths framed by the robes promise something still more virulent. Each new pox only toughens the aged plague monk, who has himself become a disease that walks. So now we will move on to a few interesting notes about Skrolk. On tabletop, Skrolk's Rod of Corruption was different than it is in Total Warhammer. On tabletop, when Skrolk attacked an enemy with the rod, it took a toughness test. If the enemy failed the test, the model struck was killed instantly. In Total Warhammer, this was changed to be a direct damage ability that hits enemies in a radius around Skrolk. Skrolk's Liber Bubonicus was also changed slightly. In tabletop, it was equally as effective against single combatants as units that had multiple combatants. In Total Warhammer, it was made effective against single combatants and weak against multiple combatant units. Next up is the Plague Lord. Plague Lords are the Clan Pestilens version of a Warlord, replacing it in both the Clan Pestilens army list and the Bubonic Court army list. A Plague Lord is the second highest position one can reach in Clan Pestilens, and all Plague Lords are directly under the command of Nurglitch. A Plague Lord does not have to be able to cast spells from the Skaven lore of Plague, though some Plague Lords like Skrolk do. Now, onto the stats. There are two different versions of the stats. The only difference between the two profiles is the amount of attacks per turn, with the Clan Pestilens army list version having 5 attacks per turn, to Bubonic Court army list having 4. This difference would result in only a minor change in attack speed. I use Skrolk to generate the Plague Lord's potential stats, as they have almost an identical stat line on tabletop. The only difference between Skrolk and a generic Plague Lord is the base cost, having a choice of weapon, and depending on the version, attack speed. Plague Lords had several options for weapons. They started with a hand weapon and could take an additional hand weapon, a flail, or a plague sensor. Depending on the choice, it would make them anti-infantry, armor piercing, and/or grant the contaminated effect and magical attacks. They do not wear any external armor and have no mount options. As for special rules, the Plague Lord only had Frenzy. I don't think it would be worth it for CA to add Plague Lords as their own separate lord type. They amount to a magical Skrolk. Perhaps in campaign there could simply be a version of the Skaven Warlord that is Clan Pestilens themed in appearance and gets some bonus perks to Pestilens units. Now on to the final lord choice, the Plague Pontifex. The Pontifex appears only as part of the Bubonic Court army list. In addition to the Plague Pontifex, I will also be going over its special mount, the Cauldron of 1,000 Poxes. As Clan Pestilens doesn't trust Grey Seers very much, they instead look towards the Plague Pontifexes to interpret the will of the Great Horned Rat. Pontifexes have similar stats to Grey Seers, with the Pontifex being only slightly more suited to combat. The base cost would be only slightly more expensive than a Grey Seer. When unmounted, the Pontifex should count as small and have a model count of 1. I believe its health would be in between a Grey Seer and a Warlord. Pontifexes wear no external armor, relying only on their natural toughness. On foot, Pontifexes have the lowest leadership of any Lord option. Pontifexes have average speed for a Skaven. They had a better weapon skill than a Grey Seer, but not as high as a Warlord, so Pontifexes should have melee attack and defense somewhere in between the two. The Pontifex also had an incredibly slow attack speed. Pontifexes had several options for weapons. They started with a hand weapon and could take an additional hand weapon, a flail, or a plague censer. Depending on the choice, it would make them anti-infantry, armor-piercing, and/or grant the contaminated effect and magical attacks. Pontifexes were level 2 wizards in the lore of Plague, and could be upgraded to level 3. The only mount choice for a Pontifex was the Cauldron of 1,000 Poxes. As for special rules, the only one is Frenzy. Before I talk about my conclusion on Pontifexes, I will go over their unique mount option, the Cauldron of 1,000 Poxes. Clan Pestilens got the idea of the Cauldron from Nurgle. As the Cauldron has the same stats as the Screaming Bell, I used the Bell's stat line to generate the Cauldrons. The Cauldron has some of the same special rules as the Screaming Bell, such as Causes Fear, Magic Resistance 2, which amounts to about 25% magic resistance, Altar of the Horned Rat, which grants increased leadership, Protection of the Horned Rat, which should have granted a ward save, but it was translated as 10% missile resistance, and Above the Masses, which grants increased armor. As for differences, there were several. The Cauldron did not have the Ringing the Bell rule. In Total Warhammer, the Ringing the Bell rule gives a mounted Grey Seer the abilities Wall of Unholy Sound, Unholy Clamor, and the bound spell Scorch. Instead of ringing the bell, the Cauldron gets the bound spell Plague. The Cauldron's movement was also slightly different. Instead of moving on wheels, the Cauldron is carried by Plague Monks like an Anvil of Doom. I think that the Cauldron should have a damage aura similar to the Plague Furnace, even though it didn't have this in tabletop. If CA were to add the Plague Pontifex, it would have to come with the Cauldron of 1,000 Poxes, or it wouldn't be worth it. If CA was just to bring in the Cauldron, perhaps it could replace the Screaming Bell as a mount for the Grey Seer of Plague. Now, onto my overall conclusion. I think that the only two things I would really like to see Creative Assembly add would be Nurglitch and the Cauldron of 1,000 Poxes. Plague Lords and Plague Pontifexes aren't really unique enough to be worth adding, but shouldn't be that hard to add in, as they could just use the skins and animations of Nurglitch that are already in Total Warhammer. Alright, that will be it for today's episode. Thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned for part 2, where I will talk about the heroes of Clan Pestilens, such as Morbus Sanguis, Plague Priests, Festering Chanters, and Stinking Things.